Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show. Coming up, Liz Truss's big conference speech is interrupted by climate protesters, but there's virtually zero on net zero from her. A global rise in renewable energy in the first half of the year prevents any increased need for fossil fuels. And the parched Golden State, how 94% of California is now in severe or extreme drought. Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show, where we track the changes happening to our world and interrogate some of the potential solutions to the climate crisis. So we start. And there are many reasons why Liz Truss's first conference speech as leader attracted attention today. From an environmental point of view, people wanted to know what she'd say about the UK's net zero pledge amid questions over her green credentials. And early in her speech, two Greenpeace representatives addressed their concerns directly to the new Prime Minister. Let's get them removed. And no doubt, to the disappointment of those environmental campaigners, the climate barely got a mention during the speech, and this was the sum total.
We're opening more gas fields in the North Sea and delivering more renewables and nuclear energy. This is how we will protect the Great British environment, deliver on our commitment to net zero, and tackle climate change.
Well, our climate change and energy correspondent, Hannah Thomas-Peter, is here. Thanks for joining us today. So most people would have seen that Greenpeace moment, and they will say, you know, they're holding the government to account over their climate policy.
I think there's a great deal of frustration in the campaigning movement. You know, rewind a year ago, Boris Johnson was preparing for the COP26 UN Climate Summit in Glasgow amid great fanfare, positioning the UK as a global leader on climate change. And now we're in a really different place. Liz Truss seems set on bringing in a new era of fossil fuel exploration in the UK. She lifted the moratorium on fracking. She's handing out new licences, or planning to at least, for oil and gas drilling, you know, in the North Sea. She's also ordered a review of the UK's legally enshrined net zero carbon emissions by 2050 target. And she's doing that, she says, to ensure that that target and policy remains pro-growth and pro-business, which is language we very much heard echoed in her dismissal of those Greenpeace protesters. She said, you are part, or they are part, of the anti-growth coalition. That's relatively new language. Campaigners will be really concerned that the government is starting to frame those with a green agenda as somehow anti-business, when Boris Johnson, for example, was often painting tackling climate change as a huge economic opportunity. Let's have a listen now to what one of the protesters who was there in the hall with Liz Truss said to Sky News.
This year, we felt like we really needed to take a different approach and take a direct message to the Prime Minister to say, who voted for this? Who voted for what Liz Truss and her cabinet are trying to roll out across the country? Nobody voted for fracking. Nobody voted to trash nature. Nobody voted to cut benefits. Nobody voted to slash workers' rights. Yet somehow Liz Truss seems to think that that's OK, and she seems to be hell-bent on rolling this stuff out across the economy. And we needed to come in there and send a message on behalf of the public.
Hannah, while you're here, could we talk about Alok Sharma, the president of COP26, a member of the Prime Minister's cabinet? He's come out and said that actually King Charles III should go to COP27 along with the Prime Minister.
Yes, this all stems from reporting that Liz Truss apparently asked King Charles not to go to COP27, despite him being famously passionate about environmental causes and despite having been invited. There's been no confirmation either way about the exact detail of that conversation, but we do know that King Charles is not going. Alok Sharma, who is a cabinet minister in the Conservative government, has said really clearly, speaking from a different conference in Democratic Republic of Congo, I would certainly welcome the King's attendance, and I know that many people around the world see him as a leader in this area. And it just speaks to the strength of feeling, I think, that he would undercut his Prime Minister at this moment of political jeopardy for the party and Liz Truss herself.
So interesting. Hannah, thank you so much. Now, with the COP27, the UN Climate Summit, well, it begins, doesn't it, a month tomorrow in the Egyptian Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. And a sponsorship deal between this year's conference and CocaCola has been branded greenwash by campaigners. So environmental groups say Coke is one of the world's biggest users of plastic, and a petition was launched at last year's COP calling for an end to corporate sponsorship of the talks. And Coca-Cola has told Sky News that by 2030 it will collect and recycle a bottle or a can for every one sold, regardless of where it comes from. Now, the company also pledged to reduce absolute carbon emissions by a quarter by 2030. Pakistan's climate change minister says the country has run out of money to spend on recovery from recent devastating floods and asked for prompt international help at the launch of a UN aid appeal. Sherry Raymond urged the developed world to accelerate funding for the disaster, which she said had no parallel in known history. Now, the meeting was told that the UN has only received $90 million so far. And Thai authorities have warned of possible serious floods in Bangkok and central areas ahead of expected heavy seasonal rainfall through the rest of the week. Now, the situation has been worsened by a large volume of water moving down from flooding in the north of the country. An estimated 160,000 hectares of agricultural land was hit by flooding, which damaged more than 80,000 homes. So listen, we may be in the grips of an energy crisis, but there's some rare good news today when it comes to renewable. So in the first half of this year, a rise in renewable energy, that's solar, wind and hydroelectric power, well, it prevented any need for growth in coal and gas generation for power, and that's worldwide. And in China, wind and solar energy even led to a fall in the use of fossil fuels. So a rise in wind and solar generation met 3/4 of the increased demand for energy, while hydro met the remainder. And the combined increase in renewable energy prevented a 4% increase in fossil fuel generation and saved $40 billion in fuel costs and 230 million tonnes of CO2 emissions. That's great news. Well, our climate reporter, Victoria Seabrook, is here. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that at this stage, does it?
Exactly. This is significant, and it is good news because this is all about clean power slowly muscling out fossil fuels and the pollution and the global warming that comes with that. So that clean power is being built absolutely at scale and at pace. That's because it is clean and it's very cheap to build. So solar power has fallen in cost by about 90% in a decade. And it's solar and wind that places like China and the US, huge countries, are building. So this means that although electricity demand grew this year, in the first half of this year, by about 3%, actually all of that increase in demand was met by renewable power, which meant we didn't need any increase in fossil fuel power or the emissions that comes with that. So emissions did not grow in the power sector in the first half of this year. That's huge. And experts say we're reaching that tipping point where soon not only will we meet the new demand, but we'll be able to displace existing demand. Fossil fuel use will fall, so will the emissions and the rate of global warming that comes with that. So this all goes to show that although a lot of the time the outlook on the climate can feel very bleak, and indeed it is when you look at the science, when you look at the impacts, you just have to look at Pakistan in flooding in Pakistan, drought in Europe, the energy crisis. But at the same time, we've got this rapid transformation in technology, the transition to clean power, electric vehicles, heat pumps and so on. All of these things that we're going to need to curb global warming. So this is some welcome calls for optimism.
On the right track. Victoria, thank you very much for that. Now, there are fears for safety of rural communities across California as a severe drought continues to grip the state. It's led to more people having to drill for groundwater as the reservoirs are heavily depleted. But now, heavy pumping is draining the underground aquifers and, in some cases, cutting off communities entirely. So according to US drought monitors, more than 94% of the state is in severe or extreme drought, and more than 1,200 wells have run dry this year. That's statewide, and that's a 57% increase on last year. And by contrast, fewer than 100 dry wells were reported annually. That's in 2018, 2019 and 2020. Well, Sky's Becky Cotterill has more.
Without water, communities across rural California are being forced to go without. This was once a canal, now just dry, cracked earth, a death sentence for a nearby orchard, and a serious threat to local livelihoods.
Well, this year we've actually lost 2 wells within this last month. This one and the one at my other boy's place. His is dry. So everybody's borrowing and using water someplace else.
But it's not just food supply that's at risk. Everyday life has been upended.
You can see no water. No water.
Thomas Chairez's tenants have had no running water for 2 years.
They're surviving, bringing water from a neighbor about 1,500 feet from here, and I'm paying for the water. So they do it on a daily basis. They carry their own 5 gallons on their own cars.
Californians are having to drill deeper in search of water. But for families and businesses that rely on wells, there can be a long wait to install a new one. And as climate change brings more severe droughts, people here and in other parts of the world will suffer as they watch their water supplies dry up. Becky Cotterill, Sky News.
Well, that's all for today. Thanks very much for watching.